What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tours. My name is Trevi, and we're continuing our talks about 9th edition 40k with the missions. These will be the Eternal War missions, and I don't know what role they're going to take in the 9th edition landscape in terms of formats, that is. Obviously, in 8th edition, we had Eternal War missions, and they were relegated almost entirely to casual play. Sometimes they were used for competitive events, but usually not large ones, and even if they were heavily modified. And GW used them for their GTs, but GW's in-house events typically are on the highly casual side of the competitive scene. Let's say a lot of soft scores hanging out over there. Obviously, most large tournaments are moving to use Games Workshop's official system in 9th edition. I don't know whether this will be use the Eternal War format. We have seen previewed that they will have an official tournament rules pack that they'll be releasing, obviously that you can buy. Why would you release a PDF? But I don't know if it will use the Eternal War missions or not. We'll find out, I guess, on June 25th when everything eventually comes out. In the rulebook, there is the Only War mission, and this was in the rulebook that was just released today. GW, I think, noticed that all of their rules had been leaked and decided to put out the actual PDF, which is good. At least we have an official version of it. The Only War mission in 8th edition was just for new players to sort of learn the game and get involved. That's why it was extremely simplistic. I'm not going to really talk about that. Effectively, there's player place objectives on the table. You'll get a point for Slay the Warlord, and then you get a progressive point for controlling each objective, with a bonus point available if you hold more victory points than the opponent. Pretty straightforward. Mostly meant for new players, but we will be talking about Eternal War in this case. I want to give a shout out as well to the folks over at Pro Tabletop, as well as my buddy Brad Weir, who put together this document. He's compiled all of the mission rules that we know and typed them up so that they're a little bit more legible into a comprehensive mission pack for easier play, which I do appreciate him doing. I think that's awesome, and makes grinding those testing games a lot easier. So I'll be referencing this packet. For right now, I don't know if the information in it is 100% correct. I think there are a couple typos just from lost in translation. So obviously, we have the pregame selection in setting up. We place objective markers, set up of the terrain. It is important to note that they now specify terrain cannot be set on top of objective markers, as well as it is important to note in the full rules that objective markers are defined. They're now specifically a 40 millimeter in diameter marker that you must measure from the edge of. So if you have existing ITC style objective templates, then you are good to go. Go ahead and use those. If you have the little tiny 6-inch ones, get that garbage out of here. We're using 40 millimeter markers now. You can set up terrain, obviously, inside the 3-inch bubble around that objective marker, but you cannot set it up on top overlapping the objective marker itself, which is good to know. We select secondary objectives. Secondary objectives, obviously, have been migrated over from Nova and or ITC. We have a huge selection of them. I think there's 15 or so, and we'll talk about those independently one at a time. We also have an attacker-defender role. Now, this is weird, and our super-duper don't like this. Attacker-defender doesn't really do anything. It's just the role for deployment zones. So I don't know why they call it attacker-defender, but you roll to attacker-defend, the defender to choose the deployment zone, and then that's it. Then you deploy. So you declare your reserves, so you do that right now rather than before deployment, and it looks like it's simultaneous as well, or rather than during deployment, excuse me. And it's simultaneous, and they have to arrive by round 3 as normal. I think some people were saying that they can come in at any time, and I think that's an issue of GW's match play versus open play sort of dichotomy in their rules writing. But looks like in match play, or at least in Eternal War missions, you have to be come in by turn 3 as normal. Then you deploy starting with the defender. So the defender gets to pick their deployment zone, but they have to deploy first. However, you alternate deployments, so I don't think that really matters that much. If you can't place models in your deployment zone, they can't act on turn 1. A bit of an interesting change there. I don't know how much of a difference it's going to make, but with the smaller table size, it may come into play. Then, after you deploy armies, you roll off to see who goes first. So, ITC made such a big step forward by removing this sort of interaction from the game where you deploy and then you determine who's first or second. Also, alternating deployment just takes longer than I go you go deployment. It's a huge step backwards in my opinion from the 2020 ITC packet, which really revolutionized sort of how the pregame and start of game phase goes, and made it a lot more enjoyable to play. And moving, I don't know if I want to move backwards. I think we're we're hitting some chop here, ladies and gentlemen, in the GW mission pack. At least there's no seize the initiative roll in this case, so that's good. But oh gosh, I do not like it so far. I don't like there being a separate roll for deployment zone versus going first. I don't like the alternating deployment, and I don't like that you roll to go first after you deploy. There's going to be some feel badsy moments where somebody, there's going to be situations where you feel like you have to go first and blast your opponent turn one. There's going to be situations where your opponent just deploys on the line when they don't need to, and then they get rewarded and get to kill you for no reason. I think it's going to be real bad, and I don't think it's a positive change for the game at all. So big ol' 0 on the pregame stuff already. We should note too that army rosters have been defined in the core rulebook as well, and all of your normal in 8th edition what would be considered a pregame selection, meaning psychic powers, warlord traits, in T5S2 the selection of your warlord itself, your pregame relics, stratagems like chapter master, those were all in the pregame phase in 8th edition. Now there's some weird rules. Let's see if we can find that in the roster sheet here. So here's the army roster rules from the core rulebook, at least in the spoiler. I don't think that they're in the core rules that GW just released this morning, because GW has a hard-on for not releasing the rules in their entirety. And this is a second big step backwards. Let's go through it individually. Your roster sheet includes what units in your army, what war gear they have, power rating and points value, blah, blah, blah. Then also it includes your keyword, psychic powers, warlord traits. So anything that has a Legion keyword, obviously you have to pick that when you build your roster. That has not changed. However, psychic powers, must be included on your roster sheet when you build your list. In addition, you also use any other pregame selections, litanies of battle powers, exarch powers. It also have to be on your roster sheet as well. Does not apply to rules that are selected at the start of the battle. Very strange wording here, because a lot of these selections specify you pick them at the start of the battle. Then, it specifies that sacred rights you don't. Real dumb, and I hate it. Also, if your unit has been upgraded by a stratagem before the battle, your army roster must make note of this upgrade. It includes things like chapter master, stuff like that. So here's the issue. This encompasses all before the battle stratagems. So if you have something like Webway Strike, or the Webway stratagem for Dark Eldar, or Teleportarium for Imperium factions, from Golden Light for Custodes, any of your outflank stratagems, in Talarn or in Space Wolves, anything like that, all of those must be selected in your army list. Like, what? Why? I don't even know if I want to use it. Part of the strength of the stratagems is that you get to pick them afterwards. This is ridiculous, GW. What a second huge miss from GW here. I think the sideboard aspect of warlord trait and stratagem and psychic power selection was really interesting, and one of the reasons that I sort of got interested in 8th edition 40k, and it being removed makes the game so much more boring and stupid. It's a big miss. We'll see if the tournament packet has any different rules for this. I have a feeling that it won't, to be honest, but we'll see how it goes. Then also your detachments, your specialist detachments, blah, 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 has to be in there as well. And how many command points you have. So, yeah, this is... so, obviously, that all has to happen pre-game. You have a declare reserves, which I imagine is... in transports, which I imagine has to be part of your... the strategic reserve ability that now is included in the core rulebook, which makes the strategic reserve ability more powerful than pre-game abilities from other factions, which makes zero sense. Why ever use the Space Wolves 1 CP stratagem to outflank if you're just going to use the standard pre-game reserve rules? I guess you have a little more flexibility when you come in, but you have to spend those CP when you build your army. Are you kidding me? Ridiculous. Yeah. Anyway, we'll move on. I also like that they specify that if you end the game early, you get 0 CP, and the other player plays the game out. I think that's an interesting change. All right, here we have the secondary objectives. So you'll pick 3 of these before each game. This is basically a straight rip from ITC or Nova. You'll pick 3, and there's, I think, 5 different categories, but you can pick up to 1 from each category, so you can't go really hard into killing or something like that. You have to be pretty well-rounded, which I think is good. And each of these secondaries awards a maximum of 15 points. Now, some of them are designed kind of bizarrely, where you'll score much less than 15 points by selecting them. I think for the most part, unless those are extremely easy, those are never going to be taken. At least in ITC, you typically want to take objectives that you can max out pretty reasonably, and a lot of these in this mission setup, you will not be able to. So let's go down the line here. We have Assassinate, score 3 victory points for each enemy character that is killed. Basically the same as Headhunter in ITC. You're going to be, you just need to kill 5 characters now to max that one out. Pretty reasonable if you're playing into Sororitas or Astra Militarum, something that brings a lot of characters. Although, I think we'll be seeing less characters in 9th Ed, not just because they got nerfed, but also because the detachments are going to have less HQ slots available in general, especially since the Supreme Command detachment has been removed or been significantly changed. We also bring it down, which gives you 2 VPs for a small vehicle, which is 10 wounds less, and 3 victory points for a big vehicle. So if you're playing into a big AdMech parking lot or something like that, you should be able to max this one out pretty reasonably. But you can also get it against like Venom Spam or something like that brings in a lot of small vehicles as well. We also have Titan Slayers. This one was removed from ITC for a good reason, I think, and unfortunately we see it back here in the 9th Ed packet. You get 10 points for destroying 1 Titanic model, 15 for destroying 2. Typically, at least in 8th Ed, when you play against Titans, a lot of times you'll be able to get 2 off the table, in my experience. The third one's a little questionable. In ITC, you could max it off of 1, I think, or like 1.5, right? And in this packet, it's going to be a little bit different, but I still think that it's eminently maxable against Titans, and it might be another. I think Titans will be strong in 9th edition, but one of the reasons that we stopped seeing them, I think, in 8th Ed pretty quickly was that the ITC packet was so detrimental to them, and we're kind of seeing that come back a little bit in this, which I don't love. Last up in this section, we have Slay the Warlord. Gives you 6 victory points if you kill the enemy Warlord. I can't imagine anyone ever taking this. You dock yourself 9 VPs just for grabbing it, and then also you have to kill the enemy Warlord, which is oftentimes their most difficult model to kill. Okay, why not max it if the enemy Warlord's destroyed? I think that adds an interesting dynamic to the game, and it makes it a little bit harder to pick sort of big stompy warlords to be your leader, but I don't know. I guess only 6 is what we end up with. No Mercy, No Respite, I think is going to be sort of more attrition-based. We've thinned their ranks, which gives you... It's effectively a Reaper. Gives you one kill point every time an enemy model is destroyed, and you get 10 if it's a model that has a wounds characteristic of 10 or more. I like that it specifies that if you get destroyed multiple times, you can add to the tally multiple times as well, and you get 1 point for every 10, which means you have to kill 150 equivalent points worth of models, although it does count any model, right? So it's not just infantry or whatever in like it is in ITC. If your opponent's bringing a couple vehicles and stuff like that, they can also count. And I don't believe that there's a rule specifying that models can't count towards multiple secondaries. So you could potentially bring it down to score points on all their vehicles, then also thin their ranks to score a point for every one of those vehicles that you kill as well. That one seems a little tough to score because you have to kill 150 kill points worth of models, which seems very difficult. But in some situations, like you're playing against orcs or something and they green tide a bunch, I think you're going to be able to do it. Attrition, you get 4 victory points at the end of the battle round if you killed more, basically. So you have to do this 4 rounds out of the 5 in order to max it. Seems pretty reasonable depending on the situation, but again, you're going to pick these before you know who's going first. And that, I think, is going to be a big factor in who's able to fight for that kill more. This seems fine. That seems like a fine one, to be honest. I think a lot of armies that are sort of gunline centric will take that, especially if your opponent's list is very MSU. We stand, we fight, which picks your top 3 biggest, most expensive models, and if they are alive at the end of the game, you score 5 for each. I think I like the idea of this one. I think it may be abusable, especially if your biggest models are like characters or something like that, and you can keep them relatively safe in the back. It's an easy 15 points for you, but you do have to play more defensively. We have First Strike, which scores 5 victory points at the end if any enemy units were destroyed in the first battle round. 3 if you got a kill more that turn, basically. Another one that's not gonna that you're not gonna max. You're just dock yourself 7 points there. But it is relatively easy to grab, especially if you're gonna like sort of blast your opponent with artillery on turn 1 or something. And you can be relatively safe. Maybe that's just in there for the ease. Unlike the Slay the Warlord one, this one seems pickable, but I think a lot of times you would try to avoid it. Battlefield Supremacy sounds like we're gonna grab some objectives. We have Engage on All Fronts, which I think is the new Recon. The equivalent. You score 2 victory points at the end of your turnip. If you have 1 or more units from your army wholly within 3 different table quarters. So it is a little bit different to score than Recon, and it only scores 2 VPs. You do get 3 if you have more units than your opponent in those table quarters. You have to be completely within, which means that if you have a horde of orcs or whatever, you have to be totally bunched up inside the table quarter. It's a lot harder to score in that situation. And it's only 2 victory points, which means you cannot max it out if you're not scoring those 3. It's only possible to max out if you're scoring 3 victory points every round for all 5 rounds, which seems very hard. I think this might be feasible in some situations, especially if, again, you're in that MSU-style army, but I think for the most part, we'll probably try to avoid this one. Line Breaker, you get 4 points at the end of your turn if 2 or more units from your army are wholly within your opponent's deployment zone, ignoring aircraft, which is good. Looks like Engage on All Fronts does not ignore aircraft, although I think that was in the spoiler, so that might actually ignore aircraft, but I'm not sure. I think this one's fine. You need to do it 4 times, which is hard, but with the new, if your opponent is castled up, is an army that castles really well, and you can have a lot of deep strikers that can jump back in their deployment zone, you just have to do that 4 turns. And if you have things like playing Eldar, you have Rangers, you have things like Ripper Swarms or Genestealer Cult infantry, you can deep strike them in and just pop them in a building or something and score that one pretty reasonably. And it seems to me like getting 12 points on a secondary is going to be fine. So I think doing that for just 3 rounds is probably pretty reasonable. I think Line Breaker is a pretty strong one. Domination, you get 3 victory points if you control more than half of the objective markers on the battlefield at the end of your turn. We'll have to look at the specific wording for control. If it's an ITC style control, that seems extremely good. You do have to do that every turn, but a lot of times you're going to do that at least 4 turns if you're playing an aggressive army with a lot of models. But I don't know if if the control means that you have to have controlled it for an entire round, which seems almost impossible. Now we're over at Shadow Operations, and here we get into the actions. Now, actions are sort of like engineers in 8th ed. You basically, it tells you when the action ability will tell you when you begin the action, and until you finish the action, you can't do anything. You can't shoot, you can't melee, you can't cast psychic powers, you can't do whatever. There are psychic actions that require a psychic test and just let you just require that you sack your psychic phase effectively to do them. These are going to be, I think, relatively hard, but I think it depends on the build. You might be building specifically into these specific objectives, and so you have units in your army that are good at performing actions. Sort of resilient infantry, I think, will be pretty strong. So, for example, we have Investigate Sites, which scores you 3 victory points every time you complete the special action, which is from the start of from the end of your movement phase. Excuse me. If you're within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield with no enemy units within 6 inches of that point, then you complete at the end of your turn. So this allows you to move up to a position, although I don't believe that you can perform actions if you advance that turn, meaning that you will have to set up to do it. But fortunately, you can complete it in one turn, and you don't have to have started on the point to do it. Although also having to clear the center of the table is probably a pretty reasonable ask, but it does make it a lot harder. We have Repair Teleport Homer, which gives you 5 points if you do the special action, which is a unit that is wholly within your opponent's deployment zone at the end of your movement phase can do it. Then you can, basically at the start of your next turn, you will complete it. This is another one that actually seems pretty feasible, especially if you have those deep striking infantry, because it seems to me, although I don't know the exact timing of this. So an action is failed if a unit is destroyed, makes a normal move, advances, falls back, manifests psychic power, shoots, charges, or performs a heroic intervention. Okay. And then on the strategic reserves rule, you arrive during the strategic reserve phase step of any of your movement phases. Okay. So the question being whether you can arrive into strategic reserve and immediately complete the action, but it sounds like the strategic reserve step occurs before the end of your movement phase. Otherwise, it wouldn't be inside your movement phase. So it seems to me that you can just deep strike something in your opponent's deployment zone and immediately begin doing the action. If they don't kill them immediately, you will get 5 victory points. That seems pretty reasonable, especially if your opponent doesn't have indirect fire and there's places you can hide in their deployment zone. Definitely you have to look at the table and the matchup to decide whether to do that one, but it seems pretty good to me. Raise the banners high. This one I think maybe a pretty popular one. Infantry from your army can do it at the end of your movement phase. Each unit has to be in range of a different objective marker that does not have one of your banners raised upon it. As long as your opponent isn't also next to the objective marker. You complete it at the end of your turn, so it is only a one-turn action, unlike Repair Teleport Homers. Then, if it's completed, you have your banner raised on it, and you get an additional victory point at the end of each of your command phases, as long as your opponent never controls that objective marker. This is very similar to an Adepticon mission that is, I think, has basically the same mechanic. But given that it's cumulative, you'll sort of, as soon as you do the action, you'll automatically get that 1 VP at the end of your turn, right? Then as long as it's an objective that's kind of out of the way, you're going to get it pretty reasonably. And I think you can get 2 objectives, and in some situations you may be able to get 3 with the banner on it, especially if you have an army. You have an army like orcs or something like that has a really high volume of models and then can really push across the table really far. Then they're going to be great at doing this. And if you can grab 3 objectives, you'll probably get 13 or 15 points off of this objective, which seems pretty good. We're over to Warpcraft, which is all psychic actions specifically. So like we said, these have a warp charge, and you sack your psychic phase in order to do them. So, for example, Mental Interrogation allows you to score 3 victory points if you perform a warp charge 4 off of a character 18 inches away from you. It seems fine. The debuffs to the psychic phase make it a little harder, and obviously sending your psychers within 18 inches of enemy characters is pretty risky sometimes. But if you're playing aggressively, or your opponent's playing aggressively, it may be eminently feasible to do it. And it sounds like you can do it multiple times around, so you may be able to score this out, in 2 turns pretty well if all of your psychers just sack their turns, scoring victory points, which is probably worth it. Psychic Ritual, you score 15 victory points, so it maxes out itself if you have any unit from your army complete the following psychic action 3 times. 1 psychic character can attempt to perform the action in the psychic phase if it is within 6 inches of the center. Interesting. So that is 3 times for battle, and it's any unit, so it doesn't have to be the same. So if you have a bunch of psychic characters, and they are playing pretty aggressively, it's only Warp Charge 3. You have to roll Not Snakes to pass it, and obviously that's rerollable with the command point. I think that's actually pretty good. That shouldn't be that hard to do anyway. And I'm imagining in Tyranid specifically, because I'm a Tyranid player, you can do things like you can put Swarmlord in the middle of the table, cast a Psychic Ritual, and then Hive Commander move him back away so your opponent doesn't kill him, and then he just does that every turn, and you've gotten 15 victory points. That seems really good, actually, the more I think about it, for Psychic-heavy armies. I liked it. It specifies a character, though, so that you can't like Deep Strike Paladins in there and have them use their Psychic test to score that. A Boiler Witch. If your army includes any Psyker units, you cannot pick it. You score 5 victory points at the end of each battle. At the end of the battle for each Psyker character that was destroyed, and 3 for any other Psyker unit that is destroyed. Oh my god. Wow. Okay, so good stuff, Grey Knights, I guess. You just have to kill 3 Psychers in order to do that. That makes the rest of these picks actually a little bit dangerous, because as soon as you're moving up to score these objectives, your opponent's going to kill you and score 1 billion points. All right, so now talking about the missions specifically, it looks like each mission, with not only just having objective setup listed in it, will also have a secondary objective that you can choose to be one of the 3 rather than one of the ones from the list we just gave. In addition, they will also have their own primary objective rules. So it looks like the first one here, Strike Force. It says it's a retrieval mission. I'm not sure what that means, but it looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 objectives. 2 of them deep into the player's deployment zones, which will be relatively easy to score. The other one's in the center, and it looks like the deployment zones are about 24 inches apart. Yeah, with 12 inches each to the center line. They measure this 12 inches to the center. They measure everything to the middle to allow for the objectives to be equidistant even on smaller tables, which I do appreciate, but I think we will be using the new 44 by 60 inch tables for the most part. And it looks like we have a take and hold primary objective here, where if you control, you score 5 victory points for each of the following criteria that you meet, which is control 1 or more objective markers, another one for controlling 2 or more, and then if you control more than your opponent, then you will score all 3 for a maximum of 15 points. So it looks to me like you can get 15 times 5, 75 points, plus 45 from your secondaries. Looks like there's a maximum of 120 points up for grabs, if that's right. It's a lot of points to calculate, but I guess maybe it's okay. Seems like kind of a bear, but whatever. In our secondary objectives, we can we should note as well that you control these at the start of your command phase, which means that you need to have controlled them for an entire round. So it seems to me like the way that you need to progress around the game is to control 3 objectives and really dominate that half of the table. You may be able to push through these ones, but I think your opponent's going to be able to fight you along a pretty wide front. However, if you can really shut your opponent or make them unable to engage with you on this flank, then you should be able to dominate those 3 objectives, grab those 15 points every turn, which is really what you should be going for. The secondary objective basically has you total up all of the number of units in your army. Then at the end of the game, if you have 75% or more of that number still on the table, then you'll score 15 victory points. If you have 50% between 75 and 50%, you'll score 10. And if you have less than 50% but more than 25%, you'll score 5. So it seems like kind of a win more. If you're already destroying your opponent and not really taking any casualties, you'll max this one out. Pretty good if you're playing defensively and trying to fight with artillery or something like that. I think you can probably do that pretty well. But if you are an army that brings a lot of chaff to the table, you may not want to pick this, because you'll lose a lot of that army strength pretty quickly. It does count number of units, I should mention, not number of models. So if you have sort of a high model count army or a high unit count army like an MSU style, it might not be the best pick for you. Mission number 2. Strike Force. It says frontline warfare. I wonder if these are just sort of descriptions of the of the mission. We have the same take and hold objective. I wonder if that's going to be the same for all of the missions. I haven't read these yet, so I'm just going off of exactly what I'm seeing. And then the secondary mission for this, at the start of each of your command phases, you score 3 victory points if you control the objective marker in your opponent's deployment zone. 2 for each victory objective marker that is in neither player's deployment zone. So sort of a Nexus control style thing going on. You're trying to grab the center objectives to get some victory points, and you can score potentially 5 per turn if you control the one in your opponent's deployment zone. That seems extremely difficult because it is at the end of your command phase, so you need to have grabbed it last turn and for your opponent not to have been able to fight you off. You can grab, it's 2 points for each of these, so if you are a very forward, you have a lot of forward momentum in your army and you can grab the center of the table pretty well, this might be a good one. Because you can score 4 points a turn. You just have to do that 4 turns in order to max that vital ground secondary out, which I think is pretty reasonable. Otherwise, this seems like a pretty balanced terrain or objective setup. Going for this objective is going to be very difficult, but it's also not that far away. It's only 32 inches from your opponent's objective here, which means it will probably be in range to be shot at, which will be a little bit dangerous. Overall, pretty interesting map. This is the one that was spoiled, the 4 pillars, and this is right out of the 2018, what do you call it, Eternal War packet. They had a 4 pillars. It was almost identical to this one. It uses the same take and hold progressive scoring for the primary objectives. You can pick the siphon power progressive for your one of your secondary objectives, which gives you an action to siphon power at the end of your movement phase. Then the action is completed at the end of your next command phase. So they have to be there and hang out and not die or get engaged in melee for an entire round, which seems extremely difficult. You score a number of victory points depending on how many units completed the action in that phase. If it's 1, it's 1. If it's 2, it's 3. If it's 4, it's 10. But it looks like you can do it from one objective. No, it has to be different objective markers. All right, this seems actually extremely difficult. You can probably score 1 a turn on your own objective, but it seems unlikely that you'll have a unit that can perform that action in range of multiple objectives, which is what you need to be able to do to max it out, and your opponent has to not do anything about it. Seems very difficult unless the terrain is extremely favorable for you. But we'll see how it goes. I think maybe one of the regular secondary objectives will be a little bit easier. Mission number 4, we have Eternal War. Is that right? No Man's Land? Is this the... Oh, are these Strike Force missions? Oh, these are Strike Force missions, excuse me. So I think I just was calling all of these Strike Force. So this is called Retrieval Mission. This is called Frontline Warfare. This is called 4 Pillars. This is called No Man's Land. Okay, we figured it out. That was embarrassing. Whoopsies. So the special rules... Did the other ones have special rules? They don't, right? Oh, they do. Let's read through the special rules. I think I missed these. Oh, these don't have them. That's why. So 4 pillars, you cannot set reinforcement units up within range of the objective markers. That's a big deal, especially for deep strikers coming into your opponent's deployment zone. I don't love that. And then No Man's Land, if you have a pre-battle rule that sets up anywhere on the battlefield, it must be wholly within your deployment zone. And you cannot move out of your deployment zone with pre-game moves. Whoa, oh boy. So again, if you have to select your pre-game stratagems during your list selection, you're screwed on No Man's Land. Hey, we used our infiltrators with Raven Guard or whatever, and we just can't use them in this mission here. You also can't Styges move, etc., all that stuff. That's a pretty big freaking deal, actually. Yikes, that's gross. I do like that it allows for more heavy objective placement in the center, though. I think that makes the game more interesting without sort of Space Marine Scouts becoming too powerful. So I think that'll be an interesting dichotomy to play with. And a lot of factions get kind of boned by not having the ability to forward deploy, so having one of the missions remove that from everyone, I think, is actually an interesting... It makes things a little bit more interesting. We have the same primary objectives, and then the secondary... You can try to secure the no man's land. At the end of each of your turns, you score a number of victory points equal to the current battle round marker if you control the central objective marker. Oh my god, that sounds very good. Whoa! Whoa! It does use the hammer and anvil deployment, so it is the. Looks like you have a long way to go between your safe objective marker and the middle. But that means that you're going to be scoring 1, 3, 6, 10. Yeah, so 15 if you have to grab it every turn in order to max it, but you should be able to get, I mean, I imagine you get at least 10 points off this secondary really quickly, especially if you are, again, an aggressive board control style army. You're going to be able to grab that center objective easily, especially since this is at the end of your turn, not the start of your command phase. So you only have to grab it for a single turn rather than a full round, which makes it a lot easier. I like that secondary. I think that's going to be pretty important. That also, doesn't have the rule where you can't deep strike in the middle. So if you're able to threaten your opponent enough or screen out the center enough, you can just deep strike stuff in the center and grab that objective, which I love. Scorched Earth can raise objectives. This is another, looks like an Adepticon mission coming in again. You can perform an action at the start of your movement phase, so you do have to already be next to the objective marker. As long as no enemy units are within range of it, you can only attempt to raise, looks like basically just the objectives in your opponent's deployment zone. Kind of weird that they wouldn't label them the player who can raise them, but that's okay, I guess. So you can raise the objectives on the other side of the table, but you have to be there at the start of the turn, and then at the end of the turn it's completed and the objective marker is removed. Okay, that seems... it may come into play once in a while, but you have to do it at the start of your movement phase. It's going to be very difficult to pull off. I don't think that will really ever come into play. We have the same primary objectives, and then the secondary objective we can pick. You score 5 victory points if a objective marker was raised, and you score 15 if 2 objective markers were raised. So a little sappers action going in there. I think it's very difficult. I don't know if obviously the upside is there's a huge upside here, but having to be in your opponent's deployment zone for an entire battle round seems totally untenable. I think they'll kill you. So I don't know how often that's going to be picked. And it's unlike the reason I think I like sort of the teleport homer, repair teleport homer secondary, whereas this one I think is difficult, is that repair teleport homers you can do anywhere, right? You can, especially on like a Dawn of War deployment, you can have units wherever, and your opponent has a tough time screening out the entirety of their deployment zone, whereas this, you can only be in this position. And you probably won't, because you can't put a terrain on top of the objective marker, you're probably not going to be in cover, and you're just going to be shot really hard. Vital Intelligence is the next one. We have data terminals that you hack to your control, and they will remain your control until an enemy grabs them. It's interesting to note that your enemy just has to control them at the end of a phase. So they don't have to control it for a full battle round or anything like that to flip the objective, but I do like the idea that the objectives, you flip them over to your control of your opponents. That's always an interesting mechanic every time it shows up. We do have a different primary objective here called Domination. The end of each player's command phase, you score 5 victory points for each objective marker you control. So it's basically the same. I think it's just it has a different nomenclature to call up the fact that the data terminals flip to your control rather than being able to flip back and forth. We have 2 secondary objectives just one secondary objective. That's the action below it, which gives you an action which you start doing at the end of your movement phase, so you can move before you do it. If you're in range of an objective marker with no enemy units within range of the same objective marker, it's the end of your next command phase. It is completed, so a full round. And as long as you're still within range of the same objective marker, each time you complete it, you score victory points equal to the number of objective markers you control. That's interesting. So that means that in order to score the secondary objective, you'll have to be controlling the. You'll not only have to perform the action for an entire round, but you also have to control the objectives for an entire round. Seems very difficult, but if you're dominating the middle, I think you can do it pretty well. I don't know if you're going to pick that one too often, just because your opponent has the ability to fight for those objective markers. That said, maybe if you can pull one side off, sort of like the other ones we were doing, and you can wall one side off and really dominate these two, then use that data intercept to grab 3 points every round. If you do that 5 rounds, then you'll max the objective out. Seems pretty reasonable. So maybe it's a takeable one there. It looks like there are 6 missions. This one's labeled 5 twice, unfortunately. So a bit of a typo there. But it looks like we just have 6 for these Eternal War missions. Overall, pretty interesting. I am very worried about the having to control an objective for an entire battle round to score your primary objectives. It feels very win more, in my opinion. So if you're if you have taken the center of the table and your opponent has not killed you, you're probably going to win the game anyway, and you're just at that point scoring a billion points on top of that. So it is enticing sort of aggressive play, but also gun lines are going to be able to fire and shoot you right off the middle of the table, just like the Nova format, where gun lines are insanely powerful. I do like that there are no end game primary objectives, unlike the standard Nova missions, which I think makes the game much more interactive. But I do think that having range superiority will allow you to deny your opponent enough objective points that it will be difficult to come back, especially in the late game. You might be able to grab a benefit on primaries in the first couple turns, but then after that you're going to be kind of falling apart. We'll see how it plays out, though. I haven't played any games with it, and again, this is my first read through of the rules, so these are just my first hot takes, but I am excited to get some games in and see how it goes. The things that I am super not excited about are obviously the pregame stuff. Having to declare all of your pregames when you build your army is insanity, and then also having these 2 roll-offs to deploy and then go first seems like it bogs the game down and will be unfun. We may see if house rules start to come into play there to revert that back to the sort of the 2020 ITC structure, which I think is much better. We'll see how it goes. And at the end of the day, it may just not be that big of a deal. But we have to play some games with it, and especially with that smaller table size, making things, throwing a wrench in things, and then making them all new and exciting. Anyway, it was a bit of a long video, so thanks for sticking with me. I hope you guys enjoyed this coverage of the 9th edition spoilers that are coming out. Next up, we're going to talk about some new unit profiles that just got dumped on us, and that'll be super cool, so stay tuned for that, and keep it classy, folks.